In this slidecast, I'm going to outline how I run a 3-day business model workshop. But let's start with a caveat. This workshop structure is really designed for the context that I find when I go into an organization. So use it more as an inspiration or as a starting point for the workshops and processes that you design. What is this particular context? Well, I usually work with rather large organizations, and I usually start working with one business line. And the revenue of such a business line can be anywhere between $500 million and a couple of billion. The objective is normally that the company wants to create new growth engines. The workshop size is usually 40 to 60 people, and I split them into groups of about 5 people from experience. That's a very good group size. Now, the participants usually come from all over the world, which is one of the reasons why I design it in a 3-day workshop structure, because it's too expensive to bring in these people from all over the world in 3 separate workshops. And I do make sure that people come from different functions and backgrounds of the organization, so you can really work on all aspects of the business model canvas. In terms of canvas knowledge, participants usually have some, but a very limited knowledge or exposure to the business model canvas methodology. Now let's get to the interesting part, to the workshop structure. So if we have 3 days, I structure them in morning and afternoon sessions. On the first day, I would introduce them to the business model canvas. And I go through the introduction of the different building blocks very, very quickly, because what I'm interested in is in the big picture. But I spend much more time getting people to understand the idea of business model mechanics, because I want people to think in terms of business models and not just in terms of new products or technologies. So when they start the afternoon session, they really understand what I mean with business model thinking. In the afternoon session, we're going to sketch out the as-is business model, the business model that exists in that particular business or business line at that moment in time. And I make sure that they don't try to weave in future ideas, because that's part of day 2. In the evening of day 1, I get everybody to agree that this is the as-is business model. Now, it seems pretty obvious that you could get through this very quickly, but when you get into conversations of who are really the customer segments and what are we really offering them, you'll have a very intense discussion, and it will take quite some time until you get to a real consensus. It's important to start day 2 with a shared understanding of what the current business model is. Then on day 2 in the morning, I get them to sketch out the business model environment, all the things that are going on around their business model, technology trends, competitive trends, market trends, where are the customer needs going, and so on. And I get them to do this again in groups of 5 people. And then I get them to share this knowledge together, so as a plenary we have the same understanding, a shared understanding. I get them to sketch out the business model environment with the environmental cards that we developed. After that, I get them to sketch out the strengths and weaknesses of their current business model, of their as-is business model. Not strengths and weaknesses in general, but just really of the business model. What about the value proposition? What about their channels? What about the backstage and the front stage? I really get them to do a thorough assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of their existing business model. And that is then a great starting point for the afternoon, where we really start designing, prototyping alternative growth engines, alternative business model canvases. So we start thinking about what could be. And here I use the whole arsenal of design thinking tools that you'll discover in lessons later on in this course. At the end of the day, I get them to draw a story of their business model so they can pitch it in the next morning, because the morning of day 3 is all about the different groups pitching their business model prototypes and getting feedback. And the feedback session is very important, and I use a very particular methodology here, which we'll discover later on in the course, in order to avoid all the typical political tensions that you'll find in large organizations. Then the afternoon of day 3 is really dedicated to the next steps, and in particular to this idea of testing business models before you build them. And I'll explain to the entire group what this process is all about. and the process that we use to test business models is customer development. And here's an important point. At the end of day 3, they need to understand that this was just a starting point and that all the energy that's in the room is a starting point to get out of the building and start testing their business models and continue to evolve the prototypes that they developed in the 3-day session. Let me end here with a couple of frequently observed difficulties. The first one is that organizers often say, we want to do a workshop with a group of 5 to 10 leaders. But I tell them, I don't think that's a very good idea. What I insist on is that we use larger groups, because when you use larger groups, you can integrate the knowledge of the organization and people's opinions. Why is that important? Because it will facilitate the implementation. Even if the decision making is not made in the room, when people participated, they understand what you're talking about, and implementation will become a much easier task. Something that I hear very often is that people say, well, we have very many different business models in our business line. How are we going to sketch out a shared business model? Well, turns out that that's what they think, but when they start sketching out their business model, turns out that the core business model in a business line is usually pretty homogeneous. So be careful when people tell you, oh, we have very many different business models, because usually the business model is similar and they might be at different stages, varying from one country to another. And here's one that I hear very often. I'm always very careful when I hear this one. Organizers often say, well, we already use the business model canvas. Our people know the canvas pretty well. We can go very fast on the introduction. Now, I believe them that they use the business model canvas, but what I also know is that people's understanding of business model thinking, what it really means, is always very, very basic. They usually use the canvas more as a checklist, but don't understand that for the same product or technology, you can have very, very different business models, and that business models can outcompete even better technologies. And here's something I really learned the hard way. Participants have a very hard time breaking with the business models that they have in their organization or that exist in the industry. Over time, I tried a lot of different methodologies, and I learned what didn't work, and I came to the conclusion that if we really want to develop great new business models, we need to use the entire arsenal of design thinking tools and processes that you'll discover later on in the course. Because otherwise, people can't think outside of the box. People can't come up with the best business models. And here's a dangerous point to end with. Participants usually assume that when the 3 days are over, that they're ready to execute a business model. The reason they believe this is because that's how the traditional business plan approach works. You pick an idea and then you go and implement it. Well, we're going to look at what testing business model means. So make sure that people understand the end of the workshop is not the end of the process. People really need to understand, it needs to be crystal clear that the workshop is only the beginning and that people are going to have to get out of the building and test their ideas. This business model design and innovation process is really a journey. What I learned over time is that participatory business model workshops, they really generate a stellar enthusiasm and a lot of great energy. But you really got to make sure that you can carry on that energy out of the workshop room into the process of testing business models. And if you can do that, you'll see spectacular things happening. Class dismissed.